Hi, I'm Jamie Ruby from Sci-Fi-Vision. Thanks so much for talking to me today. Really enjoyed the series. So to start, how familiar were each of you with this story? I'm guessing probably much more than I am since I'm over here in the United States. Um, Whichever order you want to go in.
Shall I kick off?
You go, John.
I was sort of vaguely familiar with it, in that I kind of lived through it, and it certainly did make a big impression on me at the time. I mean, there was a lot about the story that I didn't know, but for me, yeah, having been brought up to believe that, our rulers tended to behave in a kind of level-headed and dignified way,
Oh,
it was the first inkling that I had that that might not necessarily be the case. So it was a kind of eye-opener for me. But it was really not until I went back and started researching it that I realized just how rich a story it was.
all right. What about you, John?
I hadn't heard. I was two when this happened. Yeah. So I didn't know the story. Weirdly enough, I'm a politics graduate as well. I'm very interested in, political scandals and loved John's very English scandal as well. But I hadn't heard of this. So when I got the script, it was great because I didn't know where it was going or where it was going to end, and could not believe that it was a true story. Just straight away Googled everything and said, this is remarkable, that this is true. And then phoned my agent, said, I have to do this thing. This is just so ticks every box for me. So as I say, I was coming at it with totally fresh eyes, with no prejudice at all. And then started to, do the research, and read more books and look at stuff, from John Stonehouse and that. But I didn't know, I had no idea, like yourself, I had no awareness at all.
All right. So how, I guess, did the story, or not the story, but the show come to be? Like, whose idea was it to make it? I'm not sure if you wrote about it first, or kind of how did that happen?
I'm just trying to remember, actually. I think what happened is that I had written a book called The Dig, which was made into a film with Ray Fiennes, and the producer of that, a woman called Ellie Wood, who was really the reason that the film she stuck with it for kind of 14 years, and finally got it made. And I think she asked me what if anything I had in a kind of bottom drawer. And I'd never actually written about Stonehouse, but I'd always had this kind of idea that it was a great story that had never really been told. And I didn't want to write a book about Stonehouse because I just felt I'd be repeating myself. But I thought, well, if I try and do it as a script, then people can't accuse me of repeating myself. So it kind of went on from there, as far as I remember. And then, of course, John came on board, and, by which time the snowball had got bigger.
All right. And John, you sort of touched on this, but what was it, I guess, particularly that drew you in about this crazy story?
I think it was the potential of what we could do with it to make it, because I love true stories. The things that I'm always drawn to are true stories, things that have got an element of comedy and things that have got a real heart to it. Yeah, and there's an ability to sort of make an emotional connection with the audience as well. And this had all of that. But what I saw with just this guy's behavior, and Matthew was attached to the project by the time I got involved, and knowing how skilled a comedic actor Matthew is, I thought the potential of this script and coupled with him, what we could do to make it quite absurd and farcical and hilarious, and that was the draw for me, was to do something about, because politics has become quite nasty, over the last 6 or 7 years, both sides of the Atlantic, and I thought it's a great opportunity to poke a little bit of fun at politicians, and particularly ones who bring, that the spotlight on themselves for doing ridiculous things like John Stonehouse did. It was absolutely preposterous what he did. ridiculous. So I thought, okay, let's see if we can send them up, and that was my motivation behind it. It was sort of taken, and also a message as well to people about you got to be very careful about who you vote for. As we've seen, right? On
You can
both
hear it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So can you, either one of you, whoever wants to answer it though, kind of talk about, I guess, what it is that you have to, I guess, do different in bringing a real story to life? Because obviously there's certain things you have to be careful of. I mean, I know this isn't a totally 100% accurate depiction, but can you kind of talk a little bit just about how you sort of, balance that, I guess?
Well,
For either of you.
I didn't want to judge Stonehouse. I mean, because I think I've worked as a journalist for most of my life. So it's probably a legacy of that, where you're constantly pointing accusing fingers at people. And I just thought, no, I've had enough of that. I was just interested, and I am interested in what happens to people when circumstances bend them out of shape. And Stonehouse was a man who attached enormously high premium to how idealistic he was. And he saw himself as a man of absolute kind of ironclad principle. And so I think it's an interesting example of what happens when someone believes their own image too wholeheartedly and never conceives for a moment that they might be behaving in a way that's both utterly irrational and just idiotic. So that really, really interested me. And I think that I didn't find myself getting indignant about the way that Stonehouse had behaved. I couldn't get that steamed up about the fact he was a spy, because he was such an incompetent spy. But the big kind of moral red line, I guess, is that he allowed his wife and 3 children to think that he was dead for 5 weeks. I mean, that is just indefensible, whichever way you look at it. So I was very, very interested in how someone could have actually done something like that and lived with themselves subsequently. So that to me was the most kind of interesting trajectory of the whole thing.
What about you? Is there anything you do different in your approach to it being, real people?
Me?
Yeah.
No, I've actually done quite a few things that are based on real people. I did. My first movie was about a Jamaican orphan. It was a true story. My third movie was Stan and Ollie about about the famous comedians Laurel and Hardy. I've just done a movie called Tetris, which was a true story about the sort of the scramble for the rights of the game Tetris, which is coming out soon. And all of these have been based on real people. Yeah. So you sort of get into a rhythm of how you deal with it. And it's different every single time. I think sometimes, I think you have to be fair to them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think we have been incredibly fair to Jon Stonehouse. And the reason I say that is because it's very, his own daughter wrote about this, was that
Mm-hmm.
he, we've sent him up in terms of, comedy around the ridiculous behavior. But when you watch documentaries about Jon Stonehouse, he's quite a cynical guy, and it's a real cynical move to go and leave your wife and daughter. And there was elements of how abusive he had allegedly been to his wife physically in some instances, which we never went near. Yeah, we didn't go down that. That's not the story we were telling at all. Yeah, but I think there's a version of a story that could have been incredibly brutal and harsh to Jon Stonehouse. Now we have done it in a different way, but at the end, I don't think you come away from watching this and go, "Oh, I really hated that guy." And a lot of that's to do with Matthew's performance and stuff. I think at the end, it's all about how you feel at the end. And I think at the end, you do kind of feel for him in a way, yeah, because of his ridiculousness. You still feel for him. He passed, and I believe he didn't have much he ended up with nothing really apart. He had obviously a very loving wife, and that was the thing. The whole thing with Sheila standing by him, and they had a child and stuff. So I think we've been incredibly fair to him, and I think that's something you should do when you're doing a true story, regardless if it's how how people feel about what this character has done. You try and be fair. So, and I think that's what we have done.
I think that Stonehouse was someone who went through his life putting on one disguise after another, and by the end of the TV series, you see him and he is kind of stripped naked, and there are no disguises left anymore. And I think we all wanted that to be a poignant spectacle, really. I'm not saying that he confronts his own deficiencies, but you do see him stripped of all his kind of various veneers.
Right. I was just curious, have you heard from any of the family since you've done it, like kind of what they thought, or not that it necessarily matters? I just was curious if you've heard from any of them.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
John, you've heard from probably way more than I have, but go on.
Well, certainly Julia Stonehouse. We had a meeting with Julia Stonehouse, the producer, Ellie Wood, and I, years ago, before I started even writing the scripts. And she made it very clear that she didn't want anything to do with it, which was absolutely fine. And she is a very valiant defender of her father's reputation. And she doesn't believe that he was ever a spy. And I have to part company there with her. There's overwhelming evidence that he was a spy. There's a great bulging file on him in the Secret Service archive in Prague. And she also believes that he behaved the way he did, she says, because he was addicted to Mandrax, and that he plainly had a colossal nervous breakdown. And I have to say, I'm dubious about that as well, simply because I think that it's unlikely that anybody could be that mentally disordered and conceive an extremely elaborate scheme to fake your own death and then reappear on the other side of the world. So, we do part company in our visions of Stonehouse. But to take up John's point, we actually did try to be as fair as possible to Stonehouse, and I think to see him in as sympathetic a light as possible.
What I was going to ask you quickly is, can you talk a bit about, obviously, this is funny, but how did you kind of balance, I guess, how much comedy to bring in and how much to make it more of a serious, because it's serious. I mean, it's funny, but obviously it's a serious thing that happened. So how did you kind of, as much crazy as it is, how did you kind of balance that?
I think a lot of that comes as it's an organic thing, yeah. And I think that you have the great script by Jon. You go into rehearsals and you talk about it, and it's quite clear that there's an element of comedy there. And I think that once everybody starts to get on the same page, that gets elevated in a way, and in a performance, an actor interprets a performance a certain way. And we just felt that the funnier it was becoming, it was the correct. It felt as though we were finding the correct tone as the comedy went in there, and that was a decision. In post-production, the music score would reflect that as well, because the music score really affects the playfulness of the whole thing. Yeah, we were kind of influenced by Pink Panther in that respect. Yeah, so yeah, it's an organic thing, and then you get it in the cutting room, and then you try different things, you try out this, and then you find your level. And we just found that the comedy really worked, and when we pushed it, it really worked because, and obviously Matthew brings a lot to that on the table. Everybody knows he's such a great comedic actor, and I think you can get away with it when you've got great actors like that, So it all starts with the script, but then you just have to see which volume level you go to with it, with a comedy. But as Jon said, I think at the end it's still poignant, and I think that a lesson I learned as a younger director was if you want to make people cry, you have to make them laugh first. Okay, I'm a great believer in that, and I think that
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what we try to do in this one. As episode 3 goes further in, it just start becoming more serious as the weight of the world, you know, is on his shoulders and stuff. And so there is a tonal shift at some point. But yeah, I think we were having just so much fun doing it. Yeah. And it just, the comedy sort of ran away with itself as well, you know.
Right. Well, it works, and I enjoyed it. So good. Yeah. Thank you for talking to me, guys. I appreciate it. And
Thanks a
yeah,
lot.
have a good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon now. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Bye bye.